皆さんおはようございます。ただいまからジョセフ・スティグリッツ教授をお迎えをいたしましての朝食講演会を開催させていただきたいと思っております。国際局長の藤田幸久でございます。今回スティグリッツ教授が日本にいらっしゃいましたのは宇沢公文先生の追悼講演ということで、昨日国連大学で講演をされたわけでございます。で、2月の初めにスティグリッツ教授のお宅にお邪魔いたしましたときに、その宇沢公文先生の講演にいらっしゃるということであるならば、宇沢公文先生に関係のある2つのグループでお話をお伺いしたいということを申し上げた次第です。一つはプラトンという民主党のシンクタンクがございまして、宇沢公文先生のご指導の下でやっていたその民主党の議員の皆さん、もう一つは TPP 国民会議の共同議長が宇沢公文先生とこちらにいらっしゃっております畑中克行元日本医師会会長、その2つのグループでお話をお聞きしたいということでございました。その後、2日間の間に昨日の政府の会合等が入って昼間の時間がなくなったために、奥様のご協力もいただいて朝のお時間をいただいたということでございます。したがって今日は宇沢公文先生の弟子の2つのグループがスティグリッツ教授のお話を伺うということでございます。ということで、そういう意味でお話を聞いていただきたいと思っております。で、今日は岡田代表、長妻代行、蓮舫代行、細野政調会長ほかいらっしゃっておりますけれども、やはり一番共通しております分野がこの格差の問題ということで、その成長戦略共生社会の本部で主催しておられます長妻代表代行の方からその取り組みについて簡単にご報告をしていただいて、その後からスティグリッツ教授の講演を伺いたいというふうに思っております。それでは長妻代行の方からお願いをいたします。
どうもおはようございます。民主党代表代行の長妻昭でございます。今日は本当にスティグリッツ教授をお迎えをできて感激をしているところであります。大変奥様にもお世話になったと聞いておりますので、よろしくお伝えをください。失礼します。失礼いたしました。ちょっと若い奥様なんで。宇沢公文先生は実は私の選挙区でございまして、何度かお宅にお邪魔して本当に教えを請いました。びっくりしたのは、私がタウンミーティングを開催しましたら突然来ていただいて私の話を聞いていただいたということもありまして、本当に、今日はありがとうございます。そしてですね、我々が今この共生社会創造本部というものを作って議論しておりますのは、日本のですね最大の問題、高齢化あるいは社会保障がパンクしてしまうんではないか、こういうことについてどういう解決策があるのかということであります。支えられる側、この人たちの人口比が相当大きくなっている。そして支える側、現役世代、それが人口比が少なくなって支える側である現役世代が潰れてしまうんではないのか、こういう文脈で日本の危機が語られるんですが、しかしよく考えると、支えられる側とされている高齢者やあるいは障害をお持ちの方々が週1回でも無理なく支える側に回ることができれば、つまり支え合う力を育む、こういうことができれば日本の社会は持続可能になっていくんじゃないのかというような議論もしております。支え合う力を育んでいく、つまりそれを妨げているものはやっぱり格差の拡大、能力の発揮を阻んでいる格差の壁ではないのか、これを取り除いて多様性を認めて一人一人の力を育んでいくと、こういうようなことが日本にとって中長期的な、実はこれが経済政策ではないのか、 格差の壁に押しつぶされて、若者や子どもたちが潰れて、どうして中長期日本が成長できるのかと、こういう問題意識でございます。そして本当に我が意を得たりと思いましたのは、昨日スティグリッツ教授が官邸で説明された資料を今持っておりますけれども、ここにはですね、スティグリッツ教授の資料でありますが、格差と戦う。で、格差縮小は短期的にも長期的にも経済パフォーマンスを改善する。つまり、格差を、壁を取り除くことで、むしろ経済成長が結果として達成できるということを資料でお書きになっております。そしてまさにこの人間への投資の拡大、我々も人への投資と申し上げておりますが、それもスティグリッツ教授の資料にございます。より健康でより生産性の高い労働力を創出をする。機能するサプライサイドの施策の中に、子育て支援とか、労働参加を促進する施策とか、育児休暇とか、あるいは少数派マイノリティの包摂ということも書いてあります。それが結果として経済にプラスになるということでありまして、本当に私どもが考えている話に合致するところでございます。経済成長は目的ではなくて、幸せな生活を送るための手段である。幸福をもたらさない経済成長ではなくて、幸福をもたらす経済成長、これが必要であるというようなことであります。今日スティグリッツ教授のお話をお伺いをして、この格差の壁をどうやって取り除いて、そして中長期に支え合う力を育んで、日本国がですね、持続的な成長をするにはどうしたらいいのかと、こういうようなご示唆をいただければ大変ありがたいというふうに思っているところでございますので、ぜひよろしくお願いをしたいと思います。私からは以上であります。ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。昨日宇沢公文先生の、記念講演のシンポジウムのテーマは、人間と地球のための経済、経済学が救いとなるかというテーマでございました。で、今日は実はカメラも入れてございますけれども、教授からもご理解をいただきまして、私どもだけではなくて、宇沢公文先生の考え方を知っておられる、あるいは支持をしていらっしゃる多くの国民の皆さんにも見ていただこうということで、従いまして私どもだけではなくて、多くの皆さんにこのお話を聞いていただこうということで、カメラも入っているわけでございます。で、限られた時間でございますが、これから30分弱、教授の方からご講演をいただきまして、その後岡田代表、長妻代行の方から質疑応答のような形での対応をさせていただいて、9時までに終わりたいというふうに思っております。それではジョゼフ・スティグリッツ教授の方から30分弱ご講演をいただきたいと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to participate in this session, in part commemorating the life of Hirofumi Uzawa, who was my teacher. I studied under him in 1965 at the University of Chicago, where he had brought the best students from all over the United States to discuss economic theory, mathematical economics. He was a very powerful personality, and in just a very short time, we all became his disciples. And we all maintained a lifelong connection with Professor Uzawa. There were three themes that distinguished Professor Uzawa. He was a mathematical economist. He was one of the best mathematical economists of his generation. But underlying that mathematics were very deeply held values. And those values are values, I think, that he maintained, he lived his life by. One of them was social justice, a concern about inequality, a concern about the poor, a concern about the way our society functions, discriminates. The second was the environment. He was very committed to the environment. Economists often talk about this in terms of intergenerational equity, fairness across generations. And he was deeply concerned not only about fairness within a generation, which was the distribution of income and wealth within a generation, but fairness across generations, social justice at one moment of time and over time. And finally, he was very concerned about peace. He was very, having grown up in part during World War II, he was very committed to making sure that that kind of a occurrence never happened again. And often when I write my work about inequality, about the environment, or my book, The $3 Trillion War, which was written to try to persuade America that it should not be engaged in the war in Iraq, that it was a war that was not going to be successful and was going to cost us a great deal, I thought of Hirofumi Yuzawa. One of the points that was just raised echoes one of those that I've made in much of my work, which is maximizing GDP is not what society is about. The spending on war adds to GDP, but nobody thinks our society is better off as a result of the money that was wasted in Iraq, and especially the people who got killed didn't think it was a good way of spending money. I chaired an international commission on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, and the main theme of that meeting was, of that commission, was GDP doesn't measure what is important, and that we have to focus our attention not on GDP, but on the quality of life. That's particularly important here in Japan, because the statistics often mislead people to criticizing Japan for saying it's not growing very well. But Japan has a declining labor force. And in terms of output per hour, output per worker, is actually among the best performing of the advanced countries. So that doesn't mean it can't do better, but the single-minded focus on growth, I believe, is very much misplaced. Well, in recent years, there has developed what might be called a global progressive movement, which is focused on precisely these issues that were the mainstay of Professor Yuzawa, on social justice, on the environment, on peace. And right now is a very interesting moment in terms of the global progressive movement. Because in the United States, for instance, on one side, I don't think the progressive movement has ever been stronger. Both of the Democratic candidates have espoused policies that are broadly consistent with at least many of the pillars of the progressive movement. They've talked about inequality as being America's most important problem and what we can do about it. They talked about the environment and how we can protect it. On the other hand, never has America been a more divided society. A divided society, income, wealth, health, every metric shows a society that is moving further and further apart. And part of the reason that you see on the Republican side such anger on certain part is because for a large fraction of Americans, life has not been very good. Japan has a higher life expectancy than the United States. Japan has recognized the right of access to health for everybody. The United States is one of the, I think, the only advanced country that does not recognize that as a basic right. And the result of that is that in the United States there are large disparities in access to health. And the recent data show that among white males who are not college graduates, life expectancy is declining very strongly. American young males, for instance, who have not graduated from college, have seen their income decline year after year. The median income for men as a whole, half above, half below, is now lower than it was 40 years ago. Real wages today in the United States at the bottom are lower than they were in January 1955, 60 years ago. So those at the bottom have not seen a pay raise in 60 years. So this is not a society which is getting better every year. It's a society in which the top are doing better every year, but the vast majority are not. And that, of course, has spurred that kind of anger that you see. But unfortunately, it's not being channeled in a constructive way. On the other hand, in the Democratic side, that discontent is being channeled in a progressive way, in a way that's trying to see what we can do about those problems. So what I want to do this morning is very briefly talk about that progressive agenda. And let me say that the progressive movement has been very careful to say it's not partisan. It's not, it supports anybody, any candidate that is willing to support these ideas and talk to anybody who supports these ideas. So among the first principles is full employment. But what does full employment mean? There are some people in the United States, like the vice chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve, who says, well, we have 4.9% unemployment, and that means we're at full employment. But of course, those statistics don't reflect the lives of those who don't have a job. If you're one of those 4.9%, you don't feel fully employed. But if you look underneath the statistics, you realize the true unemployment rate in the United States is twice that number. That true unemployment rate reflects the fact that many Americans are called unemployed if they work just 1 hour a week. They're called employed if they work just 1 hour a week. But of course, that's not meaningful employment, and you can't get an income to survive. If you've looked for a job for 4 years and you still can't get a job, you're not called unemployed, but you're not employed. So when we look at the statistics, what we realize is that the true unemployment is much larger. And that is why, even with 4.9% unemployment, wages are stagnating. If there were really no unemployment, wages would be bid up. Well, the same thing is true in Japan, except you're in a better shape. You have unemployment of over 3.some%, but wages are not doing very well. And until you get truly full employment, where wage pressures are going up, you should try to continue to stimulate the economy. The only reason to stop stimulating the economy is a worry about inflation. The worry now in Japan is about deflation, and the difficulty of getting up to a 2% target. So both in the United States and in Japan, there is a need for more aggressive measures. Monetary policy has done as much as it can, and therefore the burden has to shift to fiscal policy. And here there's a fundamental principle in economics which is called the balanced budget multiplier. If you increase taxes and you increase spending in tandem, it stimulates the economy. And if you choose your taxes right and your spending right, it increases the economy by a multiple of what the spending. So, for instance, taxes that stimulate the economy are carbon tax. A carbon tax induces firms to invest to retrofit their production processes for the higher the charges of emissions. It induces homes to invest to insulate. It induces people to relocate, to buy new cars that are more fuel efficient. Now, Japan is already much more efficient than the United States, but there is still a long way to go. So a carbon tax is a tax that both raises revenue and stimulates the economy. There are other taxes like an inheritance tax. Inheritance taxes can often induce people to spend money before they die, increase revenue, and improve equality. Taxes, financial transaction tax discourages the kind of short-term speculation that destabilizes the economy and produces no real growth, reduces inequality, and raises revenue. Taxes on property, particularly capital gains taxes on property. Lower taxes on land do not result in more land. So have no negative incentive effects, but raise revenue, increase equality, and promote growth. So that's the first agenda, which is promoting full employment. The second is inclusion and discrimination. All societies engage in discrimination to some extent. There's discrimination against minorities. There's discrimination against women. Women receive, on average, a fraction of the wages that men doing comparable work with comparable qualifications. In the United States, we've been discussing a constitutional amendment for guaranteeing equal wages, but the Republicans have refused to support this idea. But there are other policies that promote inclusion. Child care, family leave policy, flexible hours, working hours. These are all aspects of inclusion. But there are other aspects of inclusion that are important, one of which was mentioned. Japan has an aging population. All societies are now having an aging population. We have an economic system that has ignored that challenge. Traditionally, when people get the age of 65, you throw them in the garbage heap and say, try to survive. And with QE, things have become even worse because many of those elderly who acted safe and bought government bonds, those bonds yield 0 interest rates. They're about to yield negative interest rates. Well, that's not a way to have a comfortable retirement. You can't live on 0 interest rates. So one has to think about how we can include these people longer in the labor force. The reason they're living longer, but they don't want to retire. We force them to retire. They are still productive. They would be productive, particularly if we retrain them. And we made work more flexible. So greater flexibility in the workplace, recognizing the imperative of inclusion, is another part of the inclusion agenda. When we talk about equality, we talk about, often people focus on redistribution, on taxes and transfers, and those are important. But in my most recent book called Rewriting the Rules, what we focus on is something different. What we realize is that countries with similar economic structures wind up with very different market income inequality. So the laws of demand and supply operate the same on both sides of the Atlantic, both sides of the Pacific, in countries that are similar stages of development, but market income is markedly different. For instance, one of the astounding things in the United States is that since the late 1970s, productivity of American labor force has roughly doubled. Wages, compensation, has stagnated. It used to be that productivity and wages moved together. Now they don't. And this is a result of what happened beginning in the Reagan era, where there was a rewriting of the rules of the market economy, rewriting the rules in ways that weakened the bargaining power of workers, increased their insecurity, and changed the economic framework in a whole variety of ways, like changes in corporate governance, changes in the enforcement of antitrust laws, and so forth. I want to conclude my brief remarks this morning by talking about one area that I understand that Hirofumi Yuzawa was very involved in, and that I've been involved in a great deal, and that are trade agreements. And these trade agreements have motivated a lot of the discussion in the United States. I was once asked by a doctor who was the president of a Latin American country whether he should sign a free trade agreement with the United States. And I first pointed out it was not a free trade agreement. If it was a free trade agreement, it would be about 3 pages. We eliminate our tariffs, you eliminate your tariffs, we eliminate our non-tariffs, you eliminate yours, we eliminate our subsidies, you eliminate yours. About 3 pages. Do you know how long the TPP agreement is? 6,000 pages. I have not met a single person who has ever read the entire agreement. That's not a free trade agreement, it's a managed trade agreement. It's a managed trade agreement that's managed for the interest of corporate interest mostly in the United States, but corporate interest in other countries as well. So when the United States, President Obama said, this agreement is about who writes the rules of trade in the 21st century, China and the United States, or he said it, do we or China write it? The question is, which we? We didn't write it. The corporate lobbyist wrote it. And what we are asking is for a trade agreement that we write, that is arrived at through a more democratic process, that the key issues are laid out in the open and discussed in the parliaments of all of the TPP countries. Well, to go back to this doctor, I asked him, as a doctor, I asked him, did you sign the Hippocratic Oath, which all doctors have to sign? And the Hippocratic Oath begins, do no harm. So I told him, he said, yes, he signed it. I said, so you can't sign the trade agreement, because that would be a violation of the oath that you had signed. It would actually even harm health, and that is your responsibility. So there are 3 parts of the trade agreement. The first part is about trade. It's a really small part because tariff barriers are already relatively low. There are special industries that get hurt, get helped, but that's a relatively small part. The second part is about access to medicine. They call it intellectual property, but it's only about medicine. And the question is access to generic medicine. Most countries have had a debate about the balance between big pharma and generics. In the United States, we had that debate 25 years ago. The result was the Hatch-Waxman Act, which created a balance. I thought it was not quite the right balance. It was too weighted for big pharma and not enough for access to generic medicines. But even with that unbalanced agreement, about 87% of all drugs are sold generically. And if it were not for that provision, the price of drugs in the United States, already the highest in the world, would be much, much higher. The drug companies knew that they could not get that changed in an open debate. And so they went in the secret trade agreement and got that unbalanced, to make it more difficult to get generic medicines. That was the key part of this provision. They didn't get everything they wanted, so they're complaining because they're used to winning everything. And I met with all the health ministers, and I said, you really have to bargain hard. And they did, but still the U.S. Big Pharma got most of what they wanted, and the effect of this agreement almost surely will be to raise the price of drugs and reduce access to generic medicines. For me, this is a big puzzle because Obama's signature achievement is Obamacare, making access to health care more affordable, greater in the United States. And yet, with this trade agreement, he is undermining his signature achievement. But the worst provision in the TPP is the investment provision. It's not about protecting investment. Let's make that clear. Because we are insisting, the United States is insisting on the same agreement with Europe, where they have good laws, even better protection of property rights. So it's not about court systems, it's not about protecting property rights, it's not about discrimination. It has nothing to do with discrimination, which is called national treatment. It is about deregulation, stopping regulations. And that provision is what the Business Roundtable wanted. It is the main reason that the business community, some of the business community, is behind it. The intent and the consequence of this part of the agreement is to make it increasingly difficult to pass new regulations as the circumstances change. We didn't know about global warming 40 years ago. We just learned about it in the 1980s. And as we learn about it, we have to pass regulations that will reduce carbon emissions. But under the TPP, if a country passes a regulation, they may be sued if the profits of the company go down. Canada has lost 9 important suits, many of them in the area of the environment. They even just lost a suit about where the company claimed that the environmental assessment was done improperly. They could have gone to the Canadian courts, but they chose to go to a biased private arbitration panel. 3 people, one appointed by the business, one by the government, and one by the two together. But the cabal of these lawyers who do these arbitration cases is such that they are very biased towards the business side. And that's why Canada's lost so many cases. The most famous case going on right now in a similar kind of legal provision is the suit by Philip Morris against Uruguay for the regulations, simply saying that you have to disclose that cigarettes are bad for your health. Just a disclosure. But that disclosure worked because people stopped buying as many cigarettes. Philip Morris's profits went down, and Philip Morris is suing for the loss of profits. They believe that they have a fundamental right to kill people. And if you take away that right, you have to compensate them. The guy who drafted the key provision, this was back in earlier investment protection, said, we've designed it so if you pass a regulation preventing plutonium in baby cereal, we will sue. So that is what is in the investment agreement. Now, they claim that this is a 21st century agreement and they've taken care of all these problems. Our lawyers have looked at that. Answer is no. They have not solved it. And the way you can see that is they've explicitly carved out tobacco, because people were so angry about tobacco. But they left climate emissions, carbon emissions. They left plutonium in baby cereal in. They left every other topic in. So the only thing that they carved out was cigarettes. But we discovered that asbestos was dangerous for your health, and we regulated asbestos. Under the current law, we can sue the asbestos manufacturers for what they've done for our health. Under the new regulations of the TPP, the asbestos manufacturers would be paid by us for not killing us. That should be totally unacceptable. It is an example of how in secret the rules are being rewritten in ways that contradict basic principles for which Hirofumi Uzawa stood. It will increase inequality and undermines basic principles of social justice and the protection of the environment. So for me, this provision by itself is grounds for rejecting TPP. And let me make one more point clear before ending. Europe has made it very clear that they will not sign an agreement with the process of adjudication with these private arbitration panels, that they've insisted on another way of doing it. So if Japan signs this agreement, it will be signing a 20th century agreement, while Europe will be getting a 21st century agreement. Why would you want an agreement that has been shown to be inadequate to the needs of a modern society? So I hope that these words of giving you some thinking about where the global progressive movement is going and how it believes the key problems of our society can be addressed today. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。
今、世界の需要不足に対応するための財政出動の議論があります。一方で日本は、大きな国債の発行残高を GDP の2倍を超える残高を抱えていて、財政の健全化というのも重要な課題です。私は日本の今の現状は、この過大な債務が企業の投資や個人の消費の妨げになっているというふうに考えておりますが、この財政健全化という話と、それから世界的な需要不足に対する投資ということをどうバランスさせていくかということについて、教授のお考えを聞かせていただきたいと思います。
Yeah, so that's why I emphasize the principle of the balanced budget multiplier. So I was saying that you can have fiscal stimulus without increasing the debt further, but you have to raise taxes. And the question is, what kind of taxes? And the mistake is a sales tax. A sales tax now would weaken the economy in a globally fragile situation. Now, to be fair, no one 8 years ago, 10 years ago, when the global financial crisis began, thought it would last as long as it did. So if the global economy were stronger, the situation would be different. You would be exporting more, your economy would be stronger. But the United States and Europe have followed, I think, mistaken policies. They've not stimulated their economy as much as they could or should. And now that China is slowing down, it's unambiguous that the global economy is not doing as well as we would have hoped. So in that context, one has to be particularly sensitive to policies that would decrease demand. The problem is lack of global aggregate demand. So then the question is, how can I stimulate the economy with the debt? And the answer is, well, raise taxes and spending, but raise taxes carefully on the carbon, raise taxes on inheritances, raise taxes on things that either stimulate the economy or don't slow it down very much, and spend the money on things that boost the economy a lot.
どうも、杉口教授ありがとうございました。それでは最後に、TPP 国民会議を代表いたしまして、日本医師会の会長でございました原中克之先生から手短に まとめのご挨拶をいただきたいと思います。
私たちがTPP 反対する国民会議というものを作りまして、宇沢先生と私が共同の代表になりました。私は宇沢先生、今日のお話を、スティグリック先生のお話を聞きますと、まるで宇沢先生が私たちに教えてくれてたすべてが含まれているような気がいたします。で、私は宇沢先生とは十数年前、県の医師会長をしていたときに、どうしても宇沢先生とお会いしたいということで、2時間の講演をお願いいたしました。それ以来、先生のお考えというのは、今回にも示されたように、共生、要するに人間はすべて人種、男女、いろんな差別というものをなくして、宗教までなくして、幸せになる世界を作ることだということが、宇沢先生の基本的な考え方だったと思います。で、私は本当にいろんなことを教わりましたけれども、私が今いろんな活動をして、皆さんと一緒に活動していることの基本になるものは、人間の存在はどういうふうな存在ではなければいけないのか、あくまでも今格差社会の話が出ましたけれども、格差社会というものがどれほど人間が生きる医療、それから社会保障というものに対する悪弊を起こすかということ、それを考えますと、私たちはこの TPP がその根源の一つに、大きな根源の一つになるということで反対しているわけです。今日は本当に同じ宇沢先生の教え子かどうか、私はずっとあれですが、ノーベル賞もらった先生のお話を聞いて、本当に親しくって言いましょうか、心の奥でいろんなことを考えていたことが本当だったんだという自信を持って、これからも活動していきたいと思います。先生、本当にありがとうございました。